You are listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast.
Welcome to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. I'm your host, Tim Hampton. My unusually well-informed guest today is Dr. Stewart Cohen. From 1984 to 2019, Stewart served as a climate change researcher with Environment and Climate Change Canada. He has taught at York University, Royal Roads University, and the University of British Columbia. He has published research in more than 100 publications and blogs at drclimatechange.com. Today, Stewart and I are discussing climate change and the importance of the recently concluded UN Climate Change Conference, COP26. Stewart, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim. It's great to be here.
It's my pleasure. So, Stewart, let's start with kind of a big question. The trouble with climate change is that it can be confused with weather change or circumstances change. I might move from one part of the city to the other and it's warmer. And there are cycles that happen within a human time frame. And so you really do need science to recognize if climate change is happening. What convinced you that climate change was happening?
Well, it's really decades of research from the atmospheric sciences community. First time I even heard about it was when I was an undergraduate student 40 years ago studying geography at McGill University, and I came across a book called The Study of Man's Impact on Climate. And so, I got interested in the topic as it was being discussed then, but I kind of put it in the back of my mind because at that time, really, the public wasn't talking about it. Fast forward a few more years, I go through graduate school. I finished that. I moved to Toronto, started teaching there. But by that time, in the early 80s, there were quite a few more people talking about it in Toronto, and there were panel discussions and so on. And then there was this professor that I knew at the University of Toronto. His name is Ken Hare. And he invited me to a meeting of a group of authors that were about to write a book called Climate Impact Assessment. And the whole idea of climate impact assessment really intrigued me because here we were talking about, well, how do you take climate information and use it to assess things that are going on, like problems with food production, problems with water and forests and the like? And can climate information help you to kind of sort out, well, what made this happen? But they're all speaking mostly about past events, a little bit about the future, mostly about the past. So, but I really enjoyed listening to all this. And I thought, well, I'd love to get into this, but I don't know how. And then a couple of years later, Environment Canada posted an announcement that said, we're looking for a research fellow to do a study on the impacts of future climate change on the Great Lakes. And I said, aha, that's it. That's my entry point. So I applied for the fellowship. I got the fellowship and I went about doing this project, had my first publication in 1986. And that's how I got my climate change research career started. And I was with them until 2019. And that whole time that I was working there, and even since then, I keep in touch with the climate change science literature, not just what I do, but all the other stuff that's out there. And that's just only reinforced my desire to stay active in this field of work. The science evidence is just so extensive, not just from the climate science world, but also from the world of impacts and effects and risks. How does climate warming affect water and food and communities and so on? It's reinforced my desire to stay active in this field of work. So that's why I'm still extremely interested in it.
The concentration or the focus on the Great Lakes is interesting because is that a possible way to draw attention to global warming by looking at specific environments and addressing what's going on there? Because you can probably make more alarm about what's happening in my backyard than you can what's going on around the world. Is that a fruitful approach, do you think?
Well, that's always been my own focus in my work, is to work at the regional scale, place-based studies. Others obviously work at larger scales, global scales. Those that produce global climate models are doing that. But to translate that to what happens in your backyard, yeah, you need some people that are able to do this work to downscale it to a specific place. And so that ended up being my first exposure in this was, could I figure out what that would mean to how much water was in the Great Lakes? Would there be more? Would there be less? Would it not make a difference? And so I was using fairly crude tools at the time and early simple scenarios of climate change at the time. But I went through this process, figured out a way to do this. And yeah, it got everybody all excited because, yeah, I was actually downscaling this to a specific place. So it wasn't just the paper that I published, but lots of people wanted to hear how I did this because they also wanted to do this. So I think when you're at the front end of an activity of this kind and you're going first, you don't really have a roadmap. But I always felt, and I guess this is my geography background talking, place is kind of important. And to be able to bring this issue down to a real location that people can identify with, it has a lot of value. So that's kind of why I did that throughout my career, was to work at that scale.
So when one embraces the idea that there's, we haven't quite got to the point, but you certainly acknowledge that there's global climate change. Do your studies lead you to conclude that that is due to human activity?
Well, again, I'm counting on the atmospheric sciences community that has been working on that aspect of the issue directly. I'm a client of theirs, basically. Right. So I work with their projections and try to figure out what it means for a place. But the community making these projections, they've done an awful lot of work on the physics of all of this. And this extends way back into the 1800s. I mean, you can go back and find literature produced by Eunice Foote of the United States in the 1850s and Svante Arrhenius of Sweden in the 1890s. The basic physics of this is if you put gases like carbon dioxide and methane in the atmosphere, it traps long-wave radiation being emitted from the ground. And the physics of that is pretty solid, and it's just been reinforced over and over again by follow-up studies throughout the 20th century. And so there's really an awful lot of evidence that, yeah, this is really happening. And we are seeing it now. Our world has warmed because the concentration of these gases has been accumulating in the atmosphere. And when the atmospheric sciences community looks for some other reason to explain why we're warming, is it the sun? Is it something else like volcanoes? They can't find it. It's simply not there. It's this. It's us. Human-caused climate change. It's real, and it's us. And they were really careful about this. You know, the first time the IPCC produced a report in 1990, language was very cautious. But every 5 or 6 years, they would do another snapshot of all the available information. And the evidence just got stronger and stronger, whether it was modeling or observations. And not just American scientists, but in Europe, in Asia, Australia, everywhere. You just have this accumulation of evidence. And so you got to the most recent IPCC report, which said the effects of these emissions on our climate is unequivocal. I mean, that word, it took them a long time to use that word, but now they're using that word. There is no doubt we are doing this. So, I take my cue from that. If they are that certain, then I, as sort of the next person in the chain, I'm very happy to say, look, I'm going to take these scenarios you're using, and I'm going to try to figure out what it means in terms of risks and impacts to a particular place.
So one of the challenges or risks we face is that what we're seeing is not linear. That as the world warms, there will be effects that take hold that make it warmer faster still. What are those concerns?
Well, I mean, you look at what we're already seeing in Canada the last few years. We've had these severe wildfire seasons going back to Fort McMurray in 2016 and what happened in BC in 2017, 2018, and then 2021, which was the fire that went through Lytton and destroyed most of the town, plus the heat dome that we had last summer that killed 600 people. And it's not just here. Australia had this massive bushfire, destroyed tens of millions of hectares of bushland, killed millions of animals. And people died not just from the fire, but from the smoke. And in all of these cases, you have these extreme events that are surprising people. They're surprising locals, they're surprising local practitioners. And we've only warmed 1 degree. So we're seeing these extreme events manifest themselves in greater and greater frequency because warming has elevated just this fraction. So clearly there is a lot of nonlinearity in the way each increment of warming starts to get felt by the system around us, by the atmosphere, by the ecosystems, and ultimately by people. So yeah, I think that this is clearly something, again, that the atmospheric sciences community has talked about. And so the information they present to the rest of us reflects that. And when we start to assess risks, then we start to see also this nonlinearity in terms of potential risks too.
So given the urgency, people have looked to COP26 and all its predecessors with the hopes of progress on halting and possibly even reversing what we're doing to the climate. Greta Thunberg's capsule review on COP26 was blah, blah, blah. Are you more hopeful now that it's concluded? Do you think that there was good work there, or was it insufficient?
Well, I really do understand Greta Thunberg's frustration. I'm really a big fan of hers. I've been following what she's done for the last 3 years or so. COP26 is number 26 because there've already been 25. This has been going on since 1995. The COP, which stands for Conference of the Parties to the original United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which itself was ratified in 1994. So yeah, it's a very long process and it's very slow. Why? Because it's a negotiation among almost 200 national governments. And each government shows up with their own objectives and their own energy situations and their own economic situations. And any decision that comes out of that requires unanimity. Mm-hmm. It's pretty hard to achieve that. And I think that COP26 actually accomplished a lot. I know Greta's disappointed, but I think it accomplished a great deal. And I mean, we can get into more detail about that if you like, but I would just want to say this: what's the alternative to COPs? A worldwide climate change police force or a military force? No government would accept that. So what COPs represent is this continuous and more intense global peer pressure with the goal of increasing levels of cooperation and effort by kind of forcing them to do this. Because look, we're all interested, we're all doing things. We really want you to do something because we're all on this planet together. But Greta Thunberg's activism is really, really important because she's creating this global youth movement around climate change. And I think that voice is being heard. And I think it's making a difference, not just to COP26, but to all the discussions that are going on. And I think if we want governments to do more on climate change, we all need to raise our voices, not just as youth protesters, but I think we have to consider our roles in elections as voters and also as consumers in the marketplace. And we can't be passive about this. Governments will not act without clear signals from voters and consumers. So if we want our governments to do more at COP, and then when they get home from COP, we have to say so as voters and consumers. We have to enable them to do more. So, I get very frustrated when people like to point their finger at a prime minister or something as though he has a magic button on his desk and all he has to do is push the button and boom, you have action. He needs to be enabled by what voters and consumers do and what they want and how they spend their money and what they say. So the ability of any government to do something is going to depend on a whole lot of people, including us.
So it's interesting that you raised a couple of points there. Voters and consumers. People, my observation, it's not empirical, but is people sometimes will vote for things and act differently as a consumer. So I may vote for clean air, but drive an SUV. And I think some of that is just, we're all pragmatic. And if fiscal policy is driving a truck down Main Street and throwing money out the back, we would probably vote against that, but we would also be in line, right? That there's a push and pull in terms of our actions. Do you think the vote is enough? Because we're voting on so many things at once when we vote.
Well, that's why I said both voting and the signals we give as consumers in the marketplace. I think that that's the role that each of us have. But I think clearly scientists have a role too in their communications. Again, when I started getting interested in this, there wasn't a whole lot of science communication with the public. I think most scientists felt really uncomfortable in doing this. I think that has changed. I think that there is now a greater realization in the climate change science community that public communication is an absolute necessity. And I think that as more and more of that kind of communication happens, then I think that the public awareness continues to grow. And I think that matters a great deal. I think that's why Greta Thunberg is out there, because she's been hearing this too. But I think public awareness at other age groups also is changing. It's being elevated. That doesn't mean there's consensus. As I'm sure you are aware, there's a pretty significant percentage of the population out there that does not want to acknowledge that human-caused climate change is real. And they've got their reasons for this, and that's an incredibly difficult challenge because we need to somehow convince them that not just that this is real, but there's a role for them in this too, and that it is in their best interest to see it that way and be part of this discussion about how do we manage this problem. And until we're able to solve that, then we're going to constantly be running into this difficulty that we can't quite get to the action plans and the implementation that we'd like to have. And we have the machinations that you saw at COP26 about certain words. Again, I don't see an alternative to COP at the international level, but here domestically in Canada, we've got to elevate the conversation about climate change to something that truly engages everyone where they live and somehow gets past the polarization that we seem to be in. That's a big, big challenge. I think scientists will clearly have a role in this, but I think practitioners will too. The more they engage in this in their field of work, engineers, foresters, the insurance industry, things like that, I think then we'll have a chance to maybe turn this conversation into a more evidence-based one and move away from this politically polarized one that we seem to have.
One of the important intersections in our lives when it comes to being a voter and a consumer is the notion of a carbon tax. We would have to vote it in. We'd have to, ask that of our politicians. But then it also has it also impacts our lives as consumers. It affects whether we buy a big house or a big car, that kind of thing. What do you see as the advantages of a carbon tax, and how does it get implemented?
I like carbon pricing. I like that instrument more than carbon offsets. And carbon offsets have been around for a long time, ever since the Kyoto Protocol, which was a very important milestone in international negotiations in the 90s. But this kind of emerged from that. I was always uncomfortable with carbon offsets, but carbon pricing I like because it's visible and it's quite easy to understand. It's a visible market signal. And it's out there to get consumers to change their behavior, to switch from the gas guzzling car to an electric vehicle. In fact, I would love to see carbon labeling so that consumers could see carbon footprints of various goods in the market, like clothing or electronics or food. And then the carbon tax would be an incentive for them to perhaps purchase the item that had a lower carbon footprint in it. Now, of course, a whole lot of other things influence the price of stuff, plus the availability of the low carbon alternative. But I think the carbon tax is an important part of the portfolio of measures we need to have. So I really like it. And I hope that we continue on the current path that we're on, that the carbon tax is supposed to escalate in increments over the next few years. I hope other countries do it. I really, really do, because I think that will be a big help to get consumers to shift what they're spending their money on. There'll be an incentive to do that, not just to the electric cars, but also hopefully, food produced at home instead of 10,000 kilometers away, or maybe even an incentive to see more clothing get manufactured here instead of 10,000 kilometers away. So yeah, I like carbon pricing.
Well, I do too.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard of the notion of making it transparent. So there could be, in Canada, we have a harmonized sales tax, a kind of, what do they call it? A VAT, a value added tax in Canada. But we could have a carbon tax actually be shown alongside. I hadn't thought of that, but it would be a signal to consumers what's happening to the environment when you make that choice.
Yeah, I think so. I think the more consumers are informed, then the more this kind of issue can influence their choice, but they still need to have choice.
Yeah.
So it's like right now with cars, I'm glad electric vehicle production is increasing. That's an extremely visible manifestation of a choice between a hard carbon and a low carbon version of personal individual mobility. But when it comes to something like clothing or your smartphone, well, that's pretty invisible. We don't know what the carbon footprint is of a pair of shoes. And whether we buy a pair of shoes that were made in Europe or made in China, like we don't have any sense of what the difference in the carbon footprint is. But I think that's going to matter. The reason we have so much carbon being emitted into the atmosphere, especially by China and India, is because they've become the world manufacturers of all these consumer goods that we buy. And they're using mostly fossil fuel energy to produce it. We don't have any direct information about our purchasing decision influencing that emission. We don't have a sense of that. If we had the labeling, and we did, and if maybe that combined with carbon pricing led to others entering the market to say, we can produce that with a lower carbon footprint, and we had that choice, I think it would matter.
Yeah.
So as much as we, again, like to point the finger at some political leader, I think the marketplace, there's an opportunity here, but only if we can get these kinds of instruments out there and if they get used by a lot of countries. So that, I think that's going to be pretty critical.
So one of the, I mean, the end result of a carbon tax would be money flowing into governments. But it's interesting to see that we still have, I think, probably almost every jurisdiction on Earth providing subsidies to carbon-based fuel, like fossil fuel industry. How could this possibly be still happening? Is this something that is not being addressed sufficiently at COP and instruments like that?
Well, COP26 produced this document called the Glasgow Climate Pact, and it actually had the phrase phasing out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Not sure what the word inefficient really means.
Phasing.
Yeah. Well, phasing, I sort of understand. Inefficient, I don't. But the point is, fossil fuel subsidies, that phrase was in the text of the Glasgow Climate Pact. It was not in the Paris Agreement, let alone any other agreement before that, like Kyoto. That's a huge advance. And again, countries that do this a lot, they probably didn't want that language in there, but they couldn't stop it. They couldn't stop that language being in there. Again, I think there was just so much pressure to acknowledge that that's part of the problem. Of course, it's there because, governments and industry have demanded that it be there. It didn't just get invented yesterday. This has been around for a long time. So that's why there's a lot of support by a lot of politicians and communities and businesses to keep these things. But the thing is, I think that's a barrier to getting us to switch to lower carbon energy. The International Energy Agency, among others, has talked about how the costs of renewables have gone down so much that they are actually cheaper than fossil fuels to produce a unit of electricity. And I recently just looked this up because I wanted to see the numbers. So there was this international agency report just came out last year on electricity, and they were comparing how much does it cost to produce a megawatt hour of electricity if you use coal versus solar photovoltaics. So in the US, the cost is $90 for coal and $30 for solar. 90 versus 30. And in China, it's kind of similar, 70 versus 35. And in India, it's 80 versus 25. They're not even close. Now, obviously, there are other barriers, especially in, say, India and China, that make it hard for them to think about, well, how do we get off coal? Because they're the ones that push so hard to change that language from,
Yes.
Phase out to phase down for coal. But if they could get rid of these subsidies, because they could see there's a financial advantage to do so, that the renewable energy industry is a great opportunity for investment and for jobs, and to get you into a clean economic path, then this would happen more quickly because the cost difference is already there. So those subsidies are in the way. But yeah, it's going to be hard to get them reduced because there is this entrenched interest that wants to keep them. So
yeah, absolutely.
I think it's a good thing if we could do that. And now that language is in the Glasgow Pact, I think the pressure will continue to be elevated, and hopefully that's what we will see.
Yeah, and that same money that governments would then have at their disposal could be used for projects like improving the grid, right? Which is one of the challenges with renewable energy is that, well, it would be great if we had a workable grid with more battery storage.
Oh yeah, well, there's obviously a lot of infrastructure costs associated with a transition from fossil fuel to electricity. For one thing, the locations where the energy is coming from are completely different. Like where you have coal, oil, and natural gas in a certain set of locations, but you have solar and hydro and wind and in a lot of other locations. So that's a massive undertaking to reorient the grid to a different supply source, among other issues associated with this. So it's going to take a while before this occurs. But again, I think you keep your eye on the prize, the long-term prize, which is you get the emissions down without hurting something important that people value, like personal individual mobility. You can still drive your car. It's going to be a different car, but you can still drive your car. Ford Motor Company announced a few months ago they were building Ford F-150 trucks that were going to be electric.
Yes.
So you can even drive a truck. DHL, the courier company, announced that they were buying a fleet of electric short-haul aircraft for their courier business. The range is something like, I don't know,
That's interesting.
500-600 kilometer range. So, a specific commercial transport vehicle available for a certain range, but think about how much of a saving on carbon emissions that would do.
Amazing.
So this is happening. We're beginning to have access to this. So all these things can work together to our benefit, but we just have to make sure that the incentives are there, the carrots are there to ensure that those things occur, and get a few sticks out to hit some of the other stuff that we don't want being produced at such a high level anymore.
You touched earlier on one of the challenges at COP26, which was coal. There was originally meant to be language about banning it, and now I think you said that they're reducing it, or what was the wording around coal?
Well, it was phase out, and then it became phase down.
Okay.
Which people were pretty upset about that because the sense was, oh, this is really watered down language. But again, the word coal did not appear in the Paris Agreement.
Interesting.
But it's in this one. Again, they couldn't stop it. They couldn't prevent that word from being there as much as they tried.
Right.
Because there's simply too much pressure coming from not just other countries, but again, I think Greta Thunberg and the youth activists and what Mark Carney's doing with his attempts to get financial investors involved. I mean, that kind of pressure is changing that conversation. And as much as we would like to see stronger language in those documents, in the end of the day, I don't think that matters. I think what matters is that the word coal is in there, and that is an admission that now everybody, including India and China, know they have got to address this, and it is in their interest to do so. They just have to give this process a chance to make other forms of energy available, and they need to invest in it themselves, and others need to help them too. But yeah, it's going to be difficult because it's very entrenched, right?
Yeah.
And coal is important because it's the highest carbon footprint of all the energy sources. It's much higher than natural gas, and it's higher also than oil. So yeah, coal is something
And
we
it's full
need
of
to
toxins.
reduce. Well, there's all the other issues associated with it too. But look, coal is what started the Industrial Revolution, and people have great loyalty to it because it helped. Coal and oil and natural gas brought us to the economy that we have now.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of loyalty to all of this. I think we have to respect that. And so, again, getting past the polarization of all of this, we have to respect the industry. We have to respect the people who've worked in the industry, because we have to bring them along with us too and say, look, we're not doing this for some kind of cultural reason. We're doing this because the atmospheric science community has given us a pretty clear message. If we don't change our ways with energy, we're heading down a path to warming that's going to hurt everybody. So we're going to have to reduce, especially the use of coal. We have to do that.
You invoke the narrative that we've used coal to industrialize. Well, of course, we being in the West, but then there are countries in the world that are desperately trying to industrialize. And for us to say, well, it was good for us, but it's not good for you, is quite galling. So you can see why they would come with the case to say, well, we still need to have some coal just to keep the lights on, literally. There are attempts to assemble funds that I believe are meant to address these kinds of imbalances. What does that look like?
Well, this was a big vote of contention in Glasgow, was this $100 billion a year that developed countries were supposed to make available to developing countries to enable them to switch from high carbon to low carbon energy. There's this term called leapfrogging, and it's actually been around a long time. I first heard this from a senior government official from Brazil at a meeting I was at, must be 35 years ago. He knew at that moment that the biggest thing blocking from Brazil from having an economy based on low carbon energy was we're still stuck with old technology, and that's the stuff that we can afford to get, and that's the stuff that developed countries send us. They send us their leftovers. And so we'd love to leapfrog directly into the new stuff, and we just need help in doing that. And he knew that then. So I think developing countries are still feeling that now. It's not that they need to have coal to industrialize. They need to have help to have new technologies to industrialize. Still want to industrialize, but couldn't we help them set up the wind and solar networks, the electric vehicle charging stations, potentially small modular nuclear reactors, more geothermal, anything that they can use that allows them to leapfrog over coal. But again, this is really tough because we couldn't raise. I mean, the countries couldn't promise the 100 billion now, and this was supposed to happen a while ago. So I can't really evaluate what the magic number is. Is 100 billion enough? Clearly, there is a need for continuous financial support to do this leapfrogging of energy technologies, but also for support for reducing risk. I mean, some of this money has to go to help them adapt to whatever climate change we're committed to. So it's not just going to be that. But yeah, we need to have a concerted and continuous effort to help them get past coal, help them leapfrog over it.
Yeah. Well, 100 billion is a considerable sum. The mitigation, so setting aside the actual preventing climate change, some of that money, as you pointed out, was about reducing the impact on people. What are some of the things we can do? Is it all about shoring up coastlines, or is it relocating people? What are the options there?
Well, there's a wide range of options, but it's very place specific. It's one big difference between greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change adaptation is that you only have one atmosphere and one unit of CO2 that goes up. It doesn't matter where it comes from. It still collects up there. But adaptation is very local because the impacts are very local. So a flood that hits Canada is different from a flood that hits Bangladesh or Haiti. Your infrastructure on the ground is at a very different state of readiness. And your options for reducing your risk and your exposure and your vulnerability are different from one place to another. So building a seawall may or may not be the right thing to do depending where you are. moving communities away from low-lying areas. Again, there may be differences in the degrees of freedom to do that too. So it's specific everywhere. It's place specific everywhere. But there's lots of options. Again, it requires planning in advance, especially planning that thinks about climate of the future, not just what did your ancestors experience years ago. So that's that requires some support too, and it needs to be sustained, organized, continuous support. It can't just be kind of ephemeral, project-based kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So both of these things are like that. Whether you're getting them to move into new low carbon technologies or getting them to reduce their risks, this is a pretty continuous effort that's required to help them do it.
Well, as you point out, there will be a COP27, and you're on the verge of making me hopeful, Stewart, which I wasn't expecting. That some of the language and some of the initiatives that go into COP26, however watered down, can be bolstered in COP27 and 28. But the fact that they're on paper is a victory.
I think so. I mean, there's lots of people have opinions about this, and emotions were running really high at COP26. And my take on that is the glass is half full, but yeah, it actually really is half full, which it could have been a hell of a lot worse. So, there's some people talking about being stubborn optimists. And I guess I'm joining that crowd of being a stubborn optimist.
One of the other measures in COP26 that was being looked at was a global methane pledge. What would that look like? I believe methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas, so that's an important an aspect to look at.
Yeah, methane's at least 20 times more powerful as a greenhouse gas per unit than carbon dioxide. And it currently accounts for around, 15 to 20% of the problem. CO2 is by far the biggest problem, but methane is certainly there. And it's very important that this could be implemented. The question is, can this happen considering all the places where methane comes from? So methane is a byproduct of natural gas production. There's often flaring going on. You see in especially some developing countries, it just gets flared away rather than get trapped and used. Because it's cheaper to flare it. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just hope it can be implemented. I hope developing countries get the assistance they need to do that, and I hope that we do that.
Was that a new measure in COP26, or was that somehow changed in COP26?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, methane was always a visible issue, but the fact that there was this specific agreement to cut methane, which actually the discussions around that started from outside the COP process. So you had individual countries saying, we're going to sign on to this methane pledge. I don't care about, who started this, and I'm just glad it started. And again, I hope that there is support given, especially to developing countries who probably need a lot of help to reduce the amount of flaring that they're doing. And methane is also coming from decomposing organic materials too, which is a big problem dealing with landfills and agricultural waste and like that. So that's another big source which requires a lot of work. So again, my hope is that there are some incentives that are offered so that different countries can actually do a better job with this.
You also touched on this a little bit, the difference between carbon pricing and carbon offsets. The way I describe it is like it's claiming that you're going to offset the carbon you produce by burning things versus just not burning anything. Was there any talk about, I guess, what is the state of affairs when it comes to global or carbon offsets? Is that something that's getting more attention or less?
Well, it sounds like it's still on the table, and activists are very worried that that's on the table a little too much. I mean, you think about the whole concept of what they talk about net zero. What's net zero? Well, net zero is the emissions that go into the air minus the sinks that you can develop. And a lot of these offsets are associated with these sinks. Now you got two kinds of sinks. One is nature. So your forests and the ocean, those are two pretty big sinks.
Yeah.
Our forest sinks, well, they keep changing because we've had wildfires and we've had pest and disease outbreaks and we've had deforestation. So we're not sure whether the state of our forest sinks, including right here in Canada, are as good as they used to be. And the ocean is a sink too, and that's why there's this concern about acidification, because oceans are absorbing so much CO2 that it's starting to change the pH a little bit, and we don't know how much longer it can continue to serve as a sink at its current rates. And a lot of these offsets are, some business will buy a certain offset for X dollars, and that offset turns out to be, say, a tree planting activity in some developing country that's experiencing deforestation. So they get the trees, and you get the credit for the offset. Again, I'm not saying that it's not good to invest in planting trees somewhere else, but if that's all you're doing, is that really going to help? But it's not just these nature-based sinks. We're also getting all this interest in these technology-based sinks, like carbon capture and storage, pulling CO2 out of the air and burying it in the ground, which there's a lot of interest in this from the fossil fuel industry, because they think they can continue to burn all the coal and oil they want. They're just saying, we're going to capture the emissions from the production site and we're going to bury it in the ground. And then there's direct air capture, which is also a very interesting piece of technology, because there you're sucking CO2 out of the air and you're turning it into some kind of solid, which I think is pretty cool. And living in Vancouver, where I do, I've become aware of this company in Squamish, BC, called Carbon Engineering, that is experimenting with direct air capture, and they're planning a facility in the US next year that's supposed to provide 1 megaton of CO2 saving a year. Well, when we assess how much we're emitting now, which is something like 50 gigatons a year, that's 50 billion tons, and the whole net zero discussion was, we need to reduce by 45%. So that's what, 23 billion tons. We need 1,000 of these direct air capture plants just to save 1 gigaton. We need 1,000 of them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, at this point, I see the tech-based sinks and even the forest-based sinks. They're a part of the portfolio that we need to have, but the tech stuff especially, I don't see where anyone has demonstrated that they can be scaled up to the point where they will really do the heavy lifting. And I don't think they can do that. I think other actions will be needed for the more of the heavy lifting, the solar, the wind, and probably expanded hydro. And because that will mean there will be less pressure on the climate if we could do that. And that means burning less fossil fuels. We can't depend on carbon capture to do that forward. And that's one of the reasons why I like electric vehicles so much, because I think that will do a lot to reduce demand for fossil fuels. But yeah, I'm not crazy about offsets, because I think too many of them are going to carbon capture or planting trees, and I would rather see carbon prices.
Yeah, I agree with you. And the other misgiving I have about carbon capture is it takes a lot of energy to capture carbon. And, we'll use solar panels. Okay, but why don't you use solar panels to make electricity to run the grid so that they don't need to burn anything? Seems like a much more direct and the solution that will last, is a literally sustainable solution, as opposed to trying to keep burning things and hide what we burn.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that.
So you raised the person of Mark Carney, who used to be our Bank of Canada governor or chairman, or I forget what the exact title is.
Yeah, I think it's governor. He was governor of the Bank of Canada, and then he was governor of the Bank of England.
The Bank of England. So he's been around, and he's certainly familiar to financial circles. And he is working to put together a consortium or one of the main people in a consortium, the face of it, I guess you could say, which is hoping to channel money from what would have gone to fossil fuel investment to sustainable investment. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm glad someone of his visibility and his stature in the finance community is taking this on. And I think that the whole idea of getting financial institutions, big investment consortiums in on this to shift investments from high carbon to low carbon energy, I think that is an absolute necessity. Again, the subsidies we have around fossil fuels, they're being backed up by governments who feel that they need to do that to keep revenues flowing and jobs. And those companies are also counting on these investment firms to do that too, to provide the money for all the upfront costs of producing. So I think that if this alliance that he's setting up with this weird acronym GFANZ, the
Yes.
Global Financial Alliance Net Zero. See, there's net zero. It shows up.
Well,
here.
that's concerning a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's what it's called, is GFANZ. And the question is whether these institutions are really going to do this. And that will depend on more than just the actions of Mark Carney. I mean, it's not just going to be about him. He will need a lot of help, just like a prime minister is going to need a lot of help. Investors, and again, consumers, they got to make their interest in green technology known. They have to vote with their wallets. And so I think that if you see more of that, then it makes Carney's job a lot easier, because then you will have willing participants in this GFANZ thing, because they will see that it is in their best interest to invest so that they make returns for their clients, for the pension funds, for the other investors that are in there. So that's why it's not him alone. He will need help in being successful in this enterprise.
So I'm a bit cynical, and I do think that there's a chance that some of the money will be a bit of a boondoggle. But what's interesting is it's a consolidation of power, or influence and funding, as opposed to electrical power. But it's a consolidation of power in a group of people who are at least ostensibly trying to make the world sustainable, that could be an offset to the power that already resides with the fossil fuel industries, right? So, if nothing else, it means they can afford lobbyists, and that could be part of the shifting tide as well.
Well, what Carney is doing is the same thing that what COP is doing, right? It's all cooperative world efforts at global peer pressure. Again, why? Because that's what we have. There isn't a climate change police out there. Nobody wants one. Certainly governments don't want one. And quite frankly, I don't think investors and banks want one either. They want to be able to work on an issue with confidence that their peers are doing the same. I think that if you have that, if you have at least a sense that we are all actually going in the same direction, then it will feed on itself. Mm-hmm. So whether you're a government thinking about imposing a carbon tax, or whether you're an investment house thinking about whether you're going to establish some kind of green tech fund and sell units of that to your pension customers, both of those things require this kind of community. So as much as Mark Carney can try to be a catalyst to build that community, again, I think he will need some help. And clearly there are others that are supporting him. World Bank, International Monetary Fund, they were all out there at COP also. Some national banks in Europe, some investment groups, like you hear the name BlackRock from time to time. They're making these kinds of public statements saying, yeah, we are interested in making this kind of shift. Again, will they do this? I think it depends on the rest of us constantly demanding that, yeah, they do this, and we're the market. We want that opportunity to invest our pension money or other things in this area. We will buy those units if you make them available.
Yeah.
So,
well, I think that, people quit smoking in public first, right? There's a transition where you at least say it's worth doing. and then you actually do it. So it is progress that they're saying it's worth doing, and it is a hopeful sign that probably some action will come from it. One of the other planks in Carney's efforts to help the environment or stem environmental change is what he calls a carbon border adjustment. And this plays into the idea that we were talking about earlier of a carbon tax, but carbon taxes are only levied at a given jurisdiction. So what happens when I get something from a different jurisdiction? Can you talk a little bit about how that will work?
Yeah, and again, he's not the first one to talk about that. It was actually a topic in the last Canadian federal election, carbon border tariffs. I believe both the Liberals and the Conservatives actually mentioned it. And it's to provide this level playing field. So if Canada's going to have a carbon tax, people who manufacture things here are afraid that they will be uncompetitive against imports that send stuff over here and they're not subject to it.
Right.
A carbon border tariff would level that kind of playing field. So if we're paying $40 a ton, that tariff would presumably be the same $40 a ton on the import. Now, again, this requires cooperation too. We need a lot of other countries to be willing to do this kind of thing as well. And then gradually that will filter into the supply chain. And manufacturers would respond to that saying, hey, can I lower the carbon footprint of what I'm exporting to this country? Then the carbon border tariff I will experience will be a lot less. So I think that a tariff like that, or carbon border adjustment, whatever you call it, it would be a really big help in the effort of getting carbon footprints of supply chains to be lower. So it's good that it's on Carney's radar. It's certainly, I think, on the radar here, and hopefully in other countries too. So the more this can spread around to a whole bunch of trading relationships, the better.
You mentioned $40 a ton of carbon dioxide, I believe, is the metric. Is that correct?
I think that's the current rate here. The plan is that it will continue to increase in $10 increments, and I think it's supposed to go up to $170 by the end of the decade.
And do you have a sense? Is there some way to put that into scale when it comes to a person's bills? Like if I spend $100 a month on gasoline for my car, what impact will that carbon tax have? Do you have a sense of that?
I'm not sure if I've got this right, but I think every $10 increment is around 2 cents per liter.
Okay.
So at right now, $40, we're probably paying close to 8 cents a liter carbon tax on our gasoline.
Yeah.
Which compared to $1.60 a liter that we're paying here, 8 cents out of $1.60 isn't really a whole lot.
So it's not crippling at all.
It's not that visible in what is the current high prices that we're at now, despite the misinformation campaigns that are constantly out there about, saying high carbon prices are hurting the economy and hurting small business and all this other stuff. It's so much lower than the other things that influence gasoline. And again, in the current system in Canada, you pay a carbon price, you get it rebated on your taxes. So, people are getting this money back too. So again, the reality is that this is not supposed to be about raising money for government. It's about getting you to change your ride,
Sure. Yeah.
So the higher the carbon price becomes, the greater the incentive, I think, for people to change their ride. At very least, they could get into a hybrid right now, because hybrids have been available for like 15 years. You don't need an electric vehicle charging station for most of these, or for any of these. I drive a hybrid myself. And yeah, you cut your gas use in half. So you cut your carbon tax payments in half, and you could do it now. And the value that you care about, which is individual personal mobility, you still have it.
Doesn't change.
No, it doesn't change. So this kind of visceral resistance that you hear about, that carbon tax affecting gas prices, when if you changed your ride, it would be a nothing burger.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very different thing. It's no longer about the numbers. It's about a personal value and identity that is being attacked by the very idea that climate change is trying to get you to change your behavior about your car or about how you feel about the fossil fuel industry. That's a much deeper kind of conversation. So we don't have that conversation nearly enough about what drives this particular resistance to accepting the reality of the science of human-caused climate change and what it means for your personal values that you believe in. That's a big deal. And I wish we could have better conversations about that, because maybe that might get us past the polarization that we feel about carbon pricing or about climate change in general.
Well, and also the figures you're talking about, and I'm sure they're within an order of magnitude of the impact, because I did spring that requested statistic from you, so I apologize. But it's not like it's going to bankrupt anybody. It's a nudge. And that nudge may get stronger and stronger, but it's something you can react to with the choice of your next car. It's not going to bankrupt you because you got a 6-cylinder right now. It's just going to nudge you into a 4-cylinder or a hybrid or an electric in the future.
Well, it was a pretty easy decision for me and my family to, get into a hybrid vehicle. There wasn't that big a difference in the price between a hybrid vehicle and another vehicle of a comparable size. Moving to the electric vehicle is a bit more of a leap, because now you have to trust that the electric vehicle charging network is going to be there whenever you want it.
Right.
And that's a bit of a different animal, because there's uncertainty about what that looks like. The retail landscape of electric vehicle charging stations versus gas stations. About gas stations, they're highly visible from the street with big signs, and there's big companies with them, and there's marketing and all that other stuff. And you don't have that with electric vehicle charging stations. They're hidden in a strip mall, or there's a couple of parking spaces in a community center parking lot. And unless you have some app or whatever it is, you don't know where they are because the signage is awful. So this is still kind of an immature aspect of the support system needed. Now, obviously, people are in electric vehicles now. There's thousands of them in the Vancouver area. And, I see Teslas everywhere. I see Nissan, Chevy Volts, Nissan Leafs. They're all over.
Yeah.
And it's only going to grow. So there's that part of it that I think needs to expand and become visible to consumers before more of them will take the leap into this. And then they will, I think, quickly find out that, carbon tax, at least when it comes to personal individual mobility, carbon tax doesn't worry me anymore.
Right. When we talk about the financial impact and who's impacted the most, the argument becomes, but this will unfairly disadvantage people who live in poverty. What's your I won't bury the lead. I think that's a tiresome argument, because there are more direct ways to help people who are impoverished than to make it possible for rich people to heat their pools for next to nothing. But what's your reaction to that? How do we get in front of that argument?
Well, this is part of also this much bigger argument about just transitions.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is that even that bigger one about just transition, it's about anyone who is going to experience some kind of disruption if we are successfully transitioning from the high carbon to the low carbon energy world. You think about your oil worker, there must be hundreds of thousands of them in Canada alone. And they don't see themselves in this transition. And of course, they're going to vote for political parties that promise that there will be no climate action that will affect your employer. We will block it as much as we possibly can. And those are the people that we need to bring along with us to get through this polarization here, because if they don't see themselves in the future, then of course they're going to vote for anyone that will block climate action. And I'm very happy to see, again, new language in a climate change document. Just transition language is in the Glasgow Pact, which is great. Again, you couldn't stop putting those words in there because there's simply too much interest in making sure that people are brought along in this process, whether they're they're poor and they can't afford an electric vehicle, or they're an oil worker and they're afraid for their jobs. They've got to be part of this. The thing is, though, no country that I'm aware of has figured out how to do this. They haven't worked out the whole choreography of this whole thing. So it's this theoretical concept that we're going to bring everyone along, but we haven't figured out how to do that, and we have to figure out how to do that. But one thing I think is really clear to me: we've got to respect the concerns of people who work in the fossil fuel industry, who are worried they're going to lose their jobs. And when I see pipeline protests, I think to myself, this is the worst possible thing that a person worried about climate change could be doing. Because when you protest against a pipeline, you're communicating a whole lot of disrespect for all the people that have worked to build it. Mm-hmm. And that makes just transition almost impossible to achieve. You've got to bring these people along with you. You've got to show respect for their trade, their science, their investment, the fact that that energy source has helped make our country what it is over the last century. Yeah. So you need to bring everyone in. So for just transition to be real, whether it's for poor people or for oil workers, we have to respect where they are, and we have to make a conscious effort to actually lay out steps that enable them to become part of this new low carbon economy, and figure out what that steps are. Is it simply about a retraining kind of thing? Is it something that looks like CERB or a wage subsidy, right, or something else like that? I mean, you look at the kind of pandemic financial instruments that were used to address the economic impacts of lockdowns. I think we learned something from that. And I would hope that a few creative folks in the public policy world could think of putting some meat on the bones of this whole concept of just transition, and move this also into the realm of helping lower income people, deal with social justice issues at the same time as you're trying to green the economy, like integrate it. Need to bring everyone in.
Yeah, absolutely. You've introduced me to a term on your website, which is drclimatechange.com. If I got that right, drclimatechange.com. And that is a climate change information supply chain. And I think you're picking up on supply chain sort of being the term that has come to all our attention in the last couple of years, thanks to the disruption from COVID. Did that term predate COVID?
Actually, by quite a lot.
Oh, did it? Fascinating.
So, I've been thinking about this for many years, and again, gets to kind of where my career has been. I've been in this middle place between the atmospheric scientists that produce projections of future climate and those in the sort of practitioner world, local planners, engineers, and so on, who are offering their professional services to communities, municipalities, transportation networks, utilities, whatever that is. This in-between spot is a spot where I think you have to offer something that I refer to as translation. So what does a temperature mean to a risk? How does one translate a climate change scenario, whether it's 1.5 degrees or 3 degrees, into a risk scenario? That number, 3 degrees, does not automatically tell you how the risk changes to the thing you care about. Risk of wildfire, a water system, heat wave, a public health system, electricity system. You need to do some translation. So there's a very important role for practitioners in this information supply chain. Planners, water managers, professional foresters, actuaries. Take their analytical tools and use that to not only assess what the potential impacts are on the system that currently exists, the system that was designed for yesterday's climate, and play some games with it, at least initially on your desktop. Play some games with it to see, well, does your water system hold up if we're in a warming scenario of 3 degrees? Will that system be able to accomplish the objectives that it was designed for? Providing water for homes, providing irrigation for fruit growers, providing ecosystem flows for fish. Will it do that? And if it can't, how do you tweak your system and then run your model again to see, well, did you achieve your objectives better? So an opportunity here to kind of assess your adaptation plans in advance and see how well they would work. So play some scenario games. So this information supply chain is just so critical to do that because it brings climate change projections into the world where the practitioners are, and we count on them for all the things around us. You know, the water systems need to work. We have this massive flooding event going on right now. Yes. That has overwhelmed the systems that were designed for yesterday's climate. We've got failures of water treatment systems. We have failures of flood protection. The same thing happened with the heat dome a few months ago in Vancouver. We had failure of a public health system, and because of that, 600 people died. So this is not climate adaptation. This is not adapting like the way our ancestors did to the historical experience of the climate events around them. This is climate change adaptation, which is anticipating climate futures, which we know will be different from the past. Well, we need a way to evaluate how this risk is different, because risk is going to be, they talk about risk being about two things, the consequence and the likelihood. You can't know this unless you translate that temperature into those two things. Practitioner tools, any help from academics who, they have hydrology models for water or forest growth models for trees. Get these new numbers and then use them as input into your world as a practitioner. If you can do that, if you have a tool for which a climate variable is a quantitative indicator in your code or in your algorithm, you might discover that for some fields of practice, they've never done this before.
Yeah.
It was always based on an observation of a historic extreme of record. And they said, well, we're going to plan for that and we're going to add some kind of safety factors,
sure,
but they've never modeled it. So now you've got climate change futures, which don't look like the past. How do you protect in advance against that? This is what keeps coming up with the heat dome and the wildfires, and now with these floods. The capability of planning for an event you've never seen before. But if they're part of a scenario and you take advantage of the available climate change information supply chain, then maybe practitioners can start to play these scenario games, and the next iteration of this plan will actually account for that and not simply for the event that your ancestors planned for 30, 40, 50 years ago. So yeah, for me, this has been a pretty big deal for me. I've included it when I've taught in the past. I'm teaching right now at Royal Roads. I talk about that too. So yeah, I think it needs to be part of training for students, but also professional development. It needs to be part of professional development for practitioners.
Yeah, that's a very eye-opening idea that diffusing the information that comes from global modeling, it impacts someone. Am I going to be developing beachfront property only to be either flooded or a desert in 50 years? This matters. People are financing all kinds of infrastructure related to that. There's so many, and not only does it let me respond, it comes back to the earlier point. It alerts me to the fact that this is real and that I can support policies that are meant to mitigate it. So it's a very valuable service to be breaking it down that way.
Yeah, and I think understanding this information supply chain, I hope, will make the engineer and the urban planner a more comfortable consumer of climate change projections as an input to their work. This is still kind of an exotic, unknown piece of information. They're all used to going to, the weather office and saying, give me the statistics for the last 30 years for such and such a location. They've done that all the time, but they've never gone to, we actually have climate services now. The Canadian government has one. It's called the Canadian Centre for Climate Services. There's been a climate service in Quebec for a long time called URENOS. British Columbia has one, the Pacific Climate Impacts Consortium. So you've got climate services. You can go and knock on their door or website and say, can you provide for me a data set of a couple of different climate change projections for this location of interest. Give me a high emission case, a medium one, a low emission case, and maybe some guidance as to how I could use this as input to the tools that I have so that I can now translate a climate scenario into a risk scenario.
Yeah.
So if the practitioner community can become comfortable consumers of climate change information, then that will make this translation a lot easier to do. And then they can bring it to their customers, which might be a city government, or it might be a hydro utility or a water board. And then you have a conversation about the government or the board's management and policy objectives meeting the new risk information coming from the practitioner they've employed that has employed them. And then the next iteration of your system plan is now designed in advance proactively for the new risk.
Right.
And we're not fighting tomorrow's war with yesterday's battle plans again. But yeah, so this has to become, part of the normal practice of all of these practitioners that we count on. So that's why this information supply chain is really, really important.
Yeah, it is absolutely vital. A couple of technological possibilities I'd like to pick your brain on. The first is small modular reactors. I've heard of this as a potential way to create a whole lot of electricity as a baseline production. What are your thoughts on them?
Yeah, well, not really my area of expertise, but I've heard of them too. I know there's an advisory committee in Canada looking at this. I know there are a whole bunch of countries looking at this, but it's kind of, I see this kind of in the same place as carbon capture and storage and direct air capture. You've got interesting technologies out there, but proponents have still not demonstrated that these things can be scaled up and reliable even. I think there's one small modular reactor operating in Russia. There's a whole lot that are on the drawing board, sketches and
Yeah.
so on. I'm sure there are a bunch in Canada because I know this committee's been operating for years. But I've yet to see it actually demonstrate itself. So I'm hoping, because I think nuclear has a role to play in reducing our carbon footprint because it's not a fossil fuel.
Right.
And small modular reactors hopefully are less expensive than the older technology. There's less waste involved. And because they're small, you can have a bunch of small ones at different places instead of some giant one. So yeah, I'd like to see the research effort here continue, but like those other two technologies, that they're not there yet.
Right.
So we're going to have to really push on the ones we know are capable of doing things: solar, wind, maybe expanded hydro, and being more efficient at the consumer end as well.
So one, if you'll indulge me, one last sort of technology that you hear about that I was hoping to get your thoughts on, and that is the involvement of hydrogen. A lot of people are saying, okay, we can produce hydrogen in a green fashion, and we can either have power cells or we can burn it for heat. What are your thoughts on a hydrogen economy?
Yeah, well, I know as much about hydrogen as small modular reactors, I'm afraid. But again, I still feel like this is another one of those things that we're still waiting for. Now, again, I'm in Vancouver, so just like the direct air capture company, I know all about Ballard Power. Mm-hmm. Ballard Power has been around for a long time, and they've been pushing hydrogen fuel cells for many, many years. And I know that business has expanded. They seem to be doing well. They're not just here. They're in the US and Europe, and I think they're even in China. So the question is, can this be scaled up as a green hydrogen as opposed to as a fossil natural gas-based hydrogen? What do they call it? Blue or gray?
Black, yeah. And or blue. And,
yeah. So I think what I'd like to see is a clear comparison of the relative carbon footprints between the green hydrogen and the other one, and
yes.
and the reliability of both of those processes. yeah, this has the potential to also be in the portfolio, and maybe this is even farther along than the other stuff. Again, given how well Ballard Power seems to be doing, and occasionally I see a hydrogen bus around here, so I'm kind of hopeful that we will see this, but we'll cautious.
Fair enough. So this has been terrific, Stewart. I thank you for opening my eyes and kindling some optimism. I do have one last question. You are the co-author of a book titled Climate Change in the 21st Century. So in the process of writing any book, I imagine your opinions change as you do research, attempting to bolster your viewpoint. You discover that, oh, actually, my viewpoint could be a little bit malleable. So there's a process of writing the book. I'm wondering how much your opinions changed as a result of that. And then how have your thoughts on climate change changed since writing the book?
Well, you asked me about that book. I mentioned that, I was teaching at UBC for a long time, and this book actually arose out of the course that I taught of the same name. It was called Climate Change of the 21st Century. And I had as a co-author a science communicator named Melissa Waddell, who was there to try to help me with my language so that it would be more of a plain language book so that it could be accessible to others. And I started writing this book in 2004. Took a long time to get it published. It finally came out in 2009. So this is kind of my snapshot of what knowledge was out there 13, 14 years ago. So there are thoughts and ideas that are in that book that I think haven't really changed. One of them being this kind of basic idea that, the atmospheric science community has said human-caused climate change is real. And folks like me who do impact studies say, yeah, this is a serious risk to ecosystems and people. I feel the same now as I did then. And in those days, it was actually a lot more challenging to work and teach while public awareness was still relatively low, but that's very, very different now. So it's a very different environment to teach this subject. But I was talking about the climate change information supply chain then, how important it was. And obviously now, I still believe that's critical.
Yes.
To have greater engagement of practitioners. That climate change adaptation is very different from adapting to climate of the past. So that is all in that book, and I still feel pretty strongly about those things. But there are other thoughts that have clearly changed in the last 13, 14 years. One is that the policy environment then was very much dominated by the Kyoto Protocol, with its heavy use of emissions trading and offsets, and the fact that you had some centrally mandated emission target for a few countries. You didn't have every country, you just had some developed countries that had emission targets. And now you have the Paris Agreement, which is a totally different model. And so I've become convinced that, yeah, Kyoto, you learned a little bit about what it means to try to create climate policy, but Paris is a very different beast from Kyoto. And I think that the greater public awareness is what helped to make Paris possible. So that's a very different framing now from where we were when I was writing this book, and all we had to talk about was Kyoto. So that's a big deal. And I think another change is the technological advances now, the fact that solar and wind are a lot cheaper now than they were then, that electric vehicles are now really on the market, and they really weren't out there then too. And I think there's one other thing that's different now than then, and that is that we've got more information about what the scenarios look like. Like we're not just getting, you get a high temperature if you've got a high emission case. We got more than that now. We've got people that are investigating in advance the potential effects of promises of emissions. So throughout the whole Glasgow process, you had statements being made about what these new promises would mean to achieving 1.5. There was a group of scientists who work for something called Climate Action Tracker. I don't know if you've ever heard of Climate Action Tracker, but they're great, So they keep tracking these promises and saying, well, what kind of temperature do we think we're going to see if this set of promises are kept? So The current path we're on is around 2.7. And if we really achieve all the promises that have been offered with Paris and with Glasgow, we could be at 1.8. And they came up with these calculations pretty quickly while the Glasgow meeting was going on. So we didn't have that kind of information out there 15 years ago, but we do now. So it's, again, adding to the whole public awareness of what a policy announcement, a policy promise might mean. And it actually pushes the whole process even farther, saying, look, if this is as far as you can get, we won't get to 1.5. So we need to do more. And we didn't have that kind of conversation back in the mid 2000s. So there are some things that are still, at least for me, the same, but others that are clearly different. And I think that's just a sign that, yeah, we're learning more all the time. And that's a good thing.
One very final question, I promise. And that is, when you wrote the book, did you anticipate faster response by now? Or are we on track, or are we slower?
Wow. I think I reflect back to the whole COP process and Greta Thunberg's frustration about why is this taking so long? And I was a little more optimistic then that we would move more quickly. And since then, CO2 is still just doing this. It's still just going up 1% every year. It's not slowing down, even though there's a lot more information out there. The public awareness is a hell of a lot higher, but we haven't bent the curve yet. So this is just such a tough nut. But what encourages me about Paris is just how the diversity of actors has really, really changed. Again, getting back to the Mark Carneys of the world, they weren't in this process in 2006 or 7,
no.
But here they are taking center stage now. I think that matters.
Yes.
And the youth protests, again, not all that visible then. They are now. I think that matters. I think if we have any chance at all of bending this curve, it's that this combination of significantly increased public awareness, demands to do more from the youth, and increased interests from the financial world, as well as the now greater availability of things like electric cars, I think that will matter. And what we really need to do is not only to sustain all of that, but again, to make a concerted effort to talk to people that don't want climate action, that want to block it. These are hard conversations, but we really need to have those conversations. We need to bring at least some of them in. It's kind of like the COVID situation where you have most people quite happy and prepared and willing to accept vaccinations, but there's a big chunk of the population that refuses to do so. And we're not going to solve COVID unless we can bring them in by talking to them, essentially. You have to coerce them, maybe, but I think we have to talk to them too. We got to do that with climate change. The people who don't want to act on climate change, we have to have difficult conversations in their backyard directly with them. And I know that's something that, we're kind of afraid to do this, but we've got to do this. So we're going to have any chance to bend this curve and speed up action. Yeah, we're going to have to get this dialogue out into those communities that right now are kind of resistant about having one.
Well, Stewart, thank you very much for this conversation. I do appreciate it. It was very eye-opening.
Thank you very much, Tim. It was great to be on this podcast with you.
My guest today was Stewart Cohen. Stewart's blog, drclimatechange.com, and information about where to get his book, Climate Change in the 21st Century, will be in the show notes. My name is Tim Hampton, and you can reach me at tim@unusuallywellinformed.com. Thanks for listening. I hope you will subscribe and join me for the next show with another unusually well-informed leader in business and technology.
Thank you for listening to the Unusually Well-Informed podcast. The opinions expressed by the host and guests on the Unusually Well-Informed podcast are their own and do not reflect that of their employer or any other affiliation.